There is a man sitting in a mansion he spent 30 years building, surrounded by everything he ever said he wanted, and he cannot remember the last time he felt at peace. There is a woman scrolling through pictures of a life that looks nothing like hers, wondering what she did wrong, why the joy she keeps chasing keeps slipping through her fingers like water. And there is an old philosopher, exiled, stripped of his fortune, writing letters from a small rented room, who somehow sounds more at peace than either of them. If happiness was something you could hunt down and capture, the richest and most successful people on earth would already have it cornered. They don't. Some of the wealthiest, most admired, most successful human beings in history have described their inner lives as a kind of quiet emergency. So maybe the problem was never that we haven't caught happiness yet. Maybe the problem is that we've been chasing it in exactly the wrong direction. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why the ancient Stoics believed the chase itself is the trap, and exactly what to build instead so that happiness simply arrives, uninvited, and stays. Welcome to Wisdom of the Stoics, ancient wisdom for the modern mind. This is the channel where we take the oldest, most battle-tested ideas in human history, forged by emperors, slaves, and statesmen who faced real suffering and real loss, and we translate them into something you can actually use today, in your actual life, with all its noise and pressure and uncertainty. If you're new here, welcome. You're about to discover a way of thinking that has quietly saved people from despair for over 2,000 years. And if you've been here before, you already know what's coming. Settle in, because this one might change how you see the entire second half of your life. Let's start with Elena. Elena was 34 years old and had done everything right. She had the degree, then the better degree. She had the job title that made people nod approvingly at dinner parties, the apartment with the view, the relationship that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine spread. And yet most nights she lay awake with a strange, hollow feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a persistent whisper that said, "Not yet, almost, just a little further, and then you'll finally feel it." She had believed, the way most of us are taught to believe, that happiness was a destination, somewhere up ahead, past the next promotion, the next relationship milestone, the next number in her bank account. So she kept moving toward it. And the strange cruelty of that belief is that the horizon moves with you. You never arrive. You just keep walking toward a line that keeps redrawing itself just out of reach. Does this sound familiar to you? Be honest with yourself for a second. Is there a version of your life where you've told yourself, "Once I get there, then I'll finally relax"? If so, I want you to sit with that thought while we go back almost 2,000 years. To a man who understood this trap better than almost anyone who has ever lived. His name was Epictetus, and his early life should have crushed any hope of happiness before it ever began. He was born a slave in the Roman Empire, in a town called Hierapolis, sometime around the year 50 of the Common Era. As a boy, his leg was reportedly broken, possibly through abuse by his master, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing about his circumstances, not where he lived, not what work he did, not even, in the eyes of Roman law, his own body. If anyone had a right to say that, happiness was impossible without first changing his external situation, it was Epictetus. And yet this is the man who built one of the most influential philosophical schools in human history around a single, radical idea that happiness has almost nothing to do with what happens to you, and everything to do with what you do with what happens to you. Epictetus eventually gained his freedom and became a teacher, and the core of his teaching can be boiled down into something he called the dichotomy of control. Some things are up to us, he taught, and some things are not. Our opinions, our desires, our aversions, our own actions, these are up to us. Our body, our reputation, our possessions, the actions of other people, these are not up to us, no matter how much we wish they were. And here is the part that changes everything. Suffering, he said, does not come from events themselves. It comes from placing our happiness inside things we do not control. Think about that for a moment. Elena believed her happiness lived inside. A promotion someone else would decide to give her. Inside a relationship that depended on another person's choices. Inside a bank balance shaped by markets and economies far beyond her influence. She had, without realizing it, handed the keys to her own peace of mind to 100 different people and circumstances that had never agreed to protect them. Is it any wonder she couldn't sleep? This is the first great insight the Stoics offer us, and I want you to really let it land, because it's not just an abstract philosophical point. It's a diagnosis of almost all modern unhappiness. We have been taught, by advertising, by social media, by well-meaning parents and teachers, that happiness is a prize waiting for us on the other side of achievement. Get the body, get the partner, get the house, get the followers, and then finally you'll feel it. But the Stoics discovered something uncomfortable and liberating at the same time. Chasing happiness through external things is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it never stays full, because the bucket was never designed to hold water that way in the first place. So, if happiness isn't out there waiting to be captured, where is it? Let's bring in our second figure, a man named Marco, and let's imagine him not as an ancient philosopher, but as someone you might actually know. Marco is 58. He spent his career building a small business from nothing, and along the way he told himself the same story so many of us tell ourselves. Once the business is stable, I'll finally enjoy my life. Once the kids are grown, I'll finally rest. Once I retire, happiness will begin. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, the business was sold, the kids had moved out, and Marco found himself standing in a quiet house with absolutely nothing left to chase. No next milestone, no next hurdle, and for the first time in decades, he had to ask himself a terrifying question. If happiness was never actually here, waiting for me to catch up to it, then what have I actually been doing with my life? This is where the second great Stoic teacher enters our story, a man who, unlike Epictetus, was born into extraordinary privilege and power. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome, arguably the most powerful human being alive during his lifetime. He commanded armies, ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents, and had access to every luxury the ancient world could offer. And yet, in the private journal he kept, never intended for publication, a journal we now call Meditations, he wrote to himself again and again with the same urgent reminder: stop waiting. Stop postponing your peace. The philosophic life, he told himself, is not something to be achieved someday in ideal conditions. It is available right now, in the middle of your actual, imperfect, unfinished day. Marcus Aurelius understood something that took Marco 58 years and an empty house to learn. Happiness was never at the destination, because there is no destination. There is only this present moment, followed by another present moment, followed by another, for as long as you're alive. If you cannot find a way to be at peace inside this moment, right now, with whatever it contains, then arriving at some future moment won't help you either, because you will simply bring the same restless, chasing mind along with you. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments below, because this is the kind of question that only means something once you say it out loud. What is the someday you've been waiting for? The someday when you'll finally relax, finally feel proud of yourself, finally feel like enough. Write it down in the comments. Not to be clever, not for likes, but because naming it is the first step to realizing it may never come on its own, and that you have more power over it than you think. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private journal that has echoed across 2,000 years. A reminder that our life is not made up of some grand future chapter, but of the accumulation of ordinary days like the one happening right now. He reminded himself that very little is needed to make a happy life, that it is all within in the way one thinks. This wasn't a comfortable platitude for a man, surrounded by soft beds and endless wine. He wrote these words while camped on freezing military frontiers, dealing with plague, betrayal, and the slow grinding weight of leading an empire during one of its most difficult periods. He wasn't theorizing about hardship from a place of comfort. He was living it, and still insisting that peace was available inside it. This brings us to the third teacher in our trio, a man whose life reads almost like a cautionary tale about the very trap we're discussing. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, a brilliant writer, an advisor to emperors, a man who owned villas, vineyards, and more gold than most of us could imagine. If anyone should have proven that happiness comes from accumulation, it was Seneca. And yet Seneca spent much of his writing warning people, quite urgently, against the very lifestyle he lived. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the peculiar psychological trap of having enough materially and still feeling an internal emptiness that no further acquisition could touch. Seneca described a state of mind common among the wealthy and successful of his time, a kind of restless dissatisfaction that made people move constantly, from city to villa to countryside, always believing the next location, the next change of scenery, would finally deliver the peace they were craving. He recognized this as a symptom, not a solution. The problem, he argued, wasn't geography or possessions at all. It was the mind carrying itself from place to place, unresolved and unchanged, expecting different surroundings to somehow fix an internal condition. You can sail to a new coastline, he warned, and you'll simply bring your same anxious self along for the voyage. Does this remind you of anything in your own life? How many times have you thought a new phone, a new relationship, a new city, a new job would finally be the thing that settled the restlessness inside you, only to feel that same restlessness reappear a few weeks or months later, quietly waiting for you in the new circumstance, unpacking its bags right alongside yours? This is perhaps the most important truth the three Stoics converge on, coming from three wildly different life experiences. Epictetus, who owned nothing and became free. Marcus Aurelius, who owned everything and remained anxious about impermanence. Seneca, who accumulated enormous wealth and warned against exactly what he'd accumulated. Three completely different circumstances, and yet all three arrived at the same conclusion. External conditions are not where happiness lives. It cannot be chased down, purchased, or arrived at. It has to be built, deliberately from the inside, using tools available to you regardless of your circumstances. So let's talk about what those tools actually are, because this is where the philosophy stops being abstract and starts becoming something you can use starting today, maybe even before this video ends. The first tool is what the Stoics called living according to nature, which is a phrase that sounds vague until you understand what they actually meant by it. They meant understanding your role clearly, accepting what is genuinely yours to influence, and directing your energy exclusively there. Elena, our first character, was pouring almost all of her emotional energy into things outside her control. Whether her boss noticed her work, whether her partner's feelings toward her deepened or faded, whether people online approved of the version of her life she presented, none of these things were actually within her power to determine. What was within her power? Her effort, her honesty, her discipline, her choice of how to respond when things didn't go her way. The moment she began redirecting her attention toward these controllable things, something remarkable happened. The background hum of anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but it began slowly to quiet. This isn't about giving up on outcomes you care about. The Stoics were not telling people to become passive or indifferent. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire. Seneca wrote prolifically and advised the most powerful man in Rome. Epictetus built a school that trained some of the era's brightest minds. These were not men who sat back and did nothing. What they understood, though, was the difference between putting your full effort into something and putting your happiness on the line for something. You can work relentlessly toward a goal while keeping your peace of mind independent from whether that specific outcome arrives on your schedule, in the shape you imagined, or at all. Let's return to Marco for a moment, standing in his quiet house after selling his business. In the months that followed, Marco did something that many people in his position never do. Instead of searching for the next external goal to chase, the next business, the next achievement to fill the space, he began asking a different question entirely. Not, what should I chase next? But what kind of person do I want to be inside each ordinary day I have left? This is a subtle but seismic shift. It moves the entire location of your happiness from an external target you may never hit to an internal practice you can engage in immediately, this very afternoon, regardless of what else is happening around you. The second tool is something the Stoics called the discipline of desire, and it might be the single most misunderstood part of their philosophy. People sometimes assume Stoicism means suppressing desire entirely, becoming a kind of emotionless robot who wants nothing and feels nothing. This is a complete misreading. What the Stoics actually taught was far more precise and, honestly, far more useful. They taught the practice of examining your desires before acting on them, asking whether a particular desire is aimed at something within your control or outside it, and adjusting your relationship to that desire accordingly. Here's a practical example. Suppose you deeply want a certain relationship to work out. Wanting connection, wanting love, these are natural, human, and not something the Stoics asked anyone to eliminate. But there's a difference between desiring to show up as a loving, honest, present partner, which is entirely within your control, and desiring that the other person feels a certain way about you or stays with you forever, which is not within your control at all. When you desire something outside your control, with the same intensity as something within your control, you set yourself up for a very particular kind of suffering, because the universe makes no promises about delivering outcomes just because you want them badly enough. James, the third figure in our story today, learned this lesson the hard way. James had spent nearly a decade of his life in a relationship he believed would eventually become permanent. He had built his sense of identity, his imagined future, his entire emotional architecture around a specific outcome, this specific person, this specific timeline, this specific version of forever. When the relationship ended, James didn't just lose a partner. He lost the entire structure he had built his happiness on top of, because that structure had never actually belonged to him in the first place. It belonged to someone else's choices, someone else's feelings, someone else's timeline, none of which he had ever truly controlled, no matter how much it had felt otherwise while things were going well. In the aftermath, a friend introduced James to the writings of Epictetus, almost as a joke, thinking it might give him something to focus on besides his grief. What James found instead was a framework that let him grieve honestly, without collapsing entirely, because it helped him see clearly what had actually been his and what had never been his to lose. His love, his effort, his honesty in that relationship, these had been real and were genuinely his. They weren't wasted, and no one could take the fact that he had shown up with integrity away from him. What had never been his was the guarantee of a particular ending. No one, no matter how devoted, is owed a specific outcome from another human being's free choices. This distinction, subtle as it sounds, became the foundation James used to slowly rebuild, not by chasing a new relationship to fill the hole, but by rebuilding his relationship with his own present moment first. I want to pause here and ask you directly, because this next question tends to reveal something important. Think of a time you were devastated by something not going the way you wanted. Now ask yourself honestly, were you upset because you failed to give your full effort? Or were you upset because the outcome, which was never fully within your control, didn't unfold the way you'd hoped? There's no wrong answer here, but noticing the difference is one of the most clarifying exercises the Stoics ever gave us. If this question hits something for you, drop a comment below. You might be surprised how many people watching this video are quietly nodding along with you right now. The third tool the Stoics offer us is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, something they called negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. It sounds bleak on the surface. Why on earth would anyone deliberately imagine losing the things and people they love? But the purpose behind this practice is not to induce anxiety. It's almost the opposite. It's designed to interrupt the psychological trap the researchers now call hedonic adaptation, our brain's tendency to quickly grow numb to good things once we have them, and to start taking them entirely for granted. Seneca wrote to a grieving friend that anticipating loss, gently and occasionally, allows us to appreciate what we currently have with a clarity we'd otherwise never access. When you imagine just for a moment what your life would be like without your health, without the people you love, without your ordinary daily comforts, something shifts. The things you've been walking past without noticing suddenly become visible again. That first cup of coffee in the morning, the sound of your children's voices in the next room, the simple fact that your legs work and can carry you where you want to go. We are surrounded by extraordinary gifts that have simply become invisible to us through familiarity, and the Stoics discovered, 2,000 years before modern psychology confirmed it, that briefly imagining their absence is one of the fastest ways to restore our ability to actually feel grateful for them. Elena began practicing this in a small, almost embarrassingly simple way. Each night before bed, instead of scrolling through images of lives that weren't hers, she spent 90 seconds imagining her own life stripped down to its essentials, and then opened her eyes back to what she actually had. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but something in her chest began to loosen. The apartment she had stopped noticing became, again, a place with a warm bed and a working roof. The relationship she had started taking for granted became, again, a daily choice two people were making to stay connected. Nothing about her external circumstances changed. What changed was her capacity to actually experience what was already there, instead of looking straight past it toward some imagined future that kept receding. The closer she got to it, this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it cuts against nearly everything modern culture teaches us about happiness. We are constantly told to want more, to upgrade, to level up, to compare our current chapter to someone else's highlight reel. The entire architecture of the attention economy depends on you feeling slightly dissatisfied with what you already have, because dissatisfaction drives clicks, purchases, and endless scrolling. The Stoics, writing millennia before any of this existed, somehow diagnosed the exact mechanism that keeps modern people exhausted and unfulfilled, despite having more material comfort than any humans in history. The chase itself, the constant forward reaching toward a horizon that keeps moving, is not a symptom of an unhappy life. It is very often the direct cause of it. Let's talk about what actually happened to Elena, Marco, and James, because I think their stories, taken together, paint a complete picture of what building happiness, rather than chasing it, actually looks like in practice. Elena stopped waiting for the promotion to validate her worth. This didn't mean she stopped working hard or stopped caring about her career. It meant she separated her sense of value as a human being from a decision that ultimately rested in someone else's hands. When the promotion eventually did come, months later she noticed something strange. It felt good, genuinely good, but it didn't feel like the arrival she had once imagined it would be. It felt like one pleasant moment inside a life that had already become, independently of that moment, quietly stable and at peace. This is the paradox the Stoics understood so clearly. When you stop needing an external outcome to complete you, you often become more capable of enjoying it fully when it does arrive, precisely because your entire sense of worth was never riding on it in the first place. Marco, in his quiet house, eventually found a new kind of purpose, not chasing another business milestone, but mentoring younger entrepreneurs, passing along not just his business knowledge but the harder-won wisdom about what actually mattered along the way. He told a friend once that he wished someone had handed him these ideas 30 years earlier, not because he regretted the life he built, but because he realized he could have enjoyed building it far more fully if he hadn't spent so much of it waiting for permission to feel at peace. James eventually did fall in love again, years later, but it looked different this time. He no longer needed the relationship to complete some story he was desperately trying to finish. He showed up fully, loved fully, remained honest about the fact that outcomes were never guaranteed, and somehow, paradoxically, this made the relationship feel more secure, not less, because it wasn't built on the fragile foundation of demanding a specific future from another human being. It was built on two people choosing each other, honestly, one present day at a time. Now, if you've been nodding along through this video, feeling like some of this speaks directly to something happening in your own life, right now, I want you to do something for me before we move into the final part of this video. Hit that like button, not because it helps some algorithm, though it does, but because it's a small, immediate action entirely within your control that tells us you found something valuable here. And it helps this message reach someone else out there tonight who might desperately need to hear it, the same way you might have needed to hear it today. Let's bring this all together into something practical, because understanding a philosophy intellectually and actually living it are two very different things. And the entire point of Stoicism was never to be an academic exercise. It was designed from the very beginning as a practical operating manual for living well, regardless of your circumstances. Start each morning with a simple question, one that Marcus Aurelius reportedly asked himself before rising from bed each day. What is within my control today, and where will I choose to place my effort? This single question asked honestly can save you hours of wasted anxiety over things you were never going to be able to change anyway. Throughout your day, when you notice yourself becoming upset, pause and ask whether the source of your frustration lies inside your control or outside it. If it's outside your control, and so much of what frustrates us genuinely is, redirect your energy toward the one thing that remains entirely yours in every single situation, your response. This is not about suppressing emotion, it's about not adding a second layer of suffering on top of an already difficult situation by demanding that reality had been different than it actually was. In the evening, spend a few minutes in honest reflection. Seneca famously reviewed his entire day each night before sleep, asking himself where he had acted well and where he had fallen short. Not to punish himself, but to calibrate, the way a navigator checks their position each night to correct course for the next day's journey. This practice, done consistently, builds a kind of internal integrity that no external validation can ever quite replicate. You start to become a person whose peace